means our class is starting. The start button has been hit. Okay, so if we look at the map, and even if you don't have it, it's fine. But if you look at the map, we have gone through 5 zones. The first zone was the 3 worlds, which are called Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. We went bottom up. So it's really Asiya, Yitzir, Bria, the world of action, the world of formation, the world of creation, which we spoke about, that it's like the garments of thought, speech, and action. It's the world, these are called worlds because they have their own self-consciousness. And then above that, in zone 2, which was lesson 2, we went into the world of Atzilus, which was God's consciousness. Even though it's finite, as is determined by the 10 Sfirot, but nevertheless, it is still God's world. And we went into zone 3, which is an infinite light of God, which is called Keter. And we talked that at great length, what the idea of infinity is, and how it reinforces all of the worlds below. And then we went into zone 4 to speak that there was even a greater level, which was called Tohu, and Tohu causes shattering of the vessels. And then we went last week into zone 6, where we spoke about the Tzimtzum and how the infinite light was actually redacted and reduced, or it concealed itself in order to reveal the finite. But everything we've talked about is about light, about godliness. What we have not talked about is about God. My screen sharing is paused. How do we unpause it? I want to screen share, resume share. Okay. From beginning. Here we are. So, sorry about that slide on top. It'll disappear soon. So we're going to talk about Or Ein Sof. Or Ein Sof is something that the Kabbalah likes to talk about. And by the way, tonight we're going to be leaving the world of Kabbalah and entering into the pure world of Hasidut. Because the world of Kabbalah is focused on Seder Ishtalshalut. The world of Kabbalah is focused on this devolution, how the divine light devolves from above to below. Hasidus is focused on God and nothing else. Achdut Hashem, the oneness of God. So there's a whole big debate about this Or Ein Sof. Where does it apply to? Keter is Or Ein Sof. Can you call God Ein Sof, that God is Ein Sof? So what's the meaning of Ein Sof? Ein Sof means light with no end. What does it mean, light with no end? In simple. Don't look at if it has a beginning or not infinite. We'll get to that in a minute. What does it mean, light with no end? So there are several meanings that are all true. Light with no end means that it doesn't end. It's always there. It's always flowing. Usually when you have energy that you exert, it has a limit of how long it can last. You you open up a flashlight, it'll last as long as the batteries are there. You open up a light, as long as the electricity is flowing, it's there, but it's not endless. Endless light means that it's always going, that the flow is always there. It cannot be limited. It's infinite by the fact that it's always flowing. Another feature or characteristic of the infinite light, or the light which is endless with no end, is that there's no distinction in the intensity and radiance of the light, whether it's closer to its source or further than its source. This is not true with finite light. You take sunlight, for instance. Sunlight is radiant. The closer you are to the source, the more radiant it is. Or Ein Sof is radiant everywhere. That's why the Arizal refers to the Or Ein Sof as an eagle. Now, not an eagle, a bird, but an eagle means a circle. Even though it's not literally a circle, but a circle has no beginning and no end, but a circle is constant. So therefore, if we remember in the last class when we talked about the Tzimtzum, and we quoted Rab Chaim Vital, so the illustration of the Or Ein Sof was like a yellow moon, like a circle. And then it's split in the middle. Why a circle? There's no space. There's because a circle has no top, it has no bottom, it has no east, it has no west. It has no north, it has no south, unless you frame it with a square. But if the circle is a pure circle, it doesn't have that. So therefore, the light of Ein Sof is true in the beginning and the end, the same thing. However, you can't refer to God as Ein Sof. And the reason you can't refer to God as Ein Sof, because Ein Sof, you don't say Ein Lo Tchila, it has no beginning. It has a beginning. It's flowing from God. It may not have an end, but it has a beginning. God has no beginning. Because God is not defined by a beginning or an end. Let's see how Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi writes this out. This is important to look in text 1. It's a very interesting concept. And with this, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, brings clarity to what the Kabbalistic scholars were speaking about the Ein Sof. There's a lot about this in the Alter Rebbe and the many other writings, but here this is pretty clear. So what does the Alter Rebbe write? Text 1, page 177. We refer to God's light as Ein Sof. What does Ein Sof mean? Without end. Instead, we don't say Ein Lo Tchila, that it has no beginning. The preference appears puzzling because essentially there's no difference. Everything that has no beginning has no end as it's known. Furthermore, based on what we said before, that the intensity of the light is equal at the beginning at the end, so we should say it has no beginning. The truth is that if we intended to refer to God's very essence, in other words, as some wanted to say, some Kabbalistic scholars say that Ein Sof goes on God. So he says, if we intend to refer to God's very essence, it would indeed be appropriate to use the phrase Ein Lo Tchila, without a beginning. Why is it that God has no beginning? We will discuss that soon. But the simple meaning for our conversation is that God doesn't have a source. The source of God is God himself. Unlike the light that flows from God, which is the source. But God has no source because there's no one that preceded him. There's no one that created him. There's no one that made him. It's as we're soon going to see, his existence is a different kind of existence. It's a mandatory existence. It's not a possible existence. It's not a contingent existence. It's an existence that needs to be and always there. So he has no source. So therefore, the only one that you can truly say that he's without a beginning is on God. So when we say the word Ein Sof, which is very common in Kabbalah, we're not describing God. This is what he says. However, what we describe as Ein Sof is in fact God's light and radiance and not God himself. To clarify, when the Kabbalists speak of the Or Ein Sof, their intention is the endless light of God, not the light of the endless one. In Hebrew, it works very well. The light is Ein Sof, as you see in the Hebrew. And not that he is the light of the Ein Sof. Why? For they are not attempting to describe the origin of the light as endless, for we cannot describe God himself as endless. Now, here he's saying something else as well. So God is the only one that has no beginning, and therefore he has no end. But we can't describe God as having no end, because the moment we say that he is endless and he has no end, it implies that he has a beginning, and he doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have a source. So everything that we've learned until now, with the highest levels, the most abstract concepts of the divine, whether it's in Tohu and Tikkun, or even before the Tzimtzum, the radiance that wasn't definable, all of that is talking about light. And the term light means it's a revelation, it's an energy that flows from God, but it's not God himself. So then, how do we refer to God? I don't know how to get rid of this box, but this one? Oh, that one. See, I'm computer illiterate. There you go. We needed an engineer. Going the wrong way. Okay. So Orein Sof is godliness. It's an expression of God, but it's not God himself. And remember, we talked about the difference between godliness and God. Godliness means it's an extension of God. Its consciousness is God, but it's not God himself, because God is not describable. There is a word, however, that is used in Hasidus, and it's called atzmut. I want to get to it. Sorry that I'm having, here we go. So the word that you will find in Hasidic terminology, you will not find this in Kabbalah, but you will find it in Hasidic discourses, is that when they talk about God, they call him atzmut. Actually, it's called atzmut mahut. But atzmut is the real word. What does the word atzmut mean? Atzmut comes from the word etzem. Now, most people know etzem is a bone, but the true meaning of etzem is not a bone. The true meaning of etzem is the essence itself, the source itself, the issue itself. Like in a person, the etzem of the person is the essence of the person himself, the real person. So for that reason, with a lack of any other attribute, when we're trying to describe God, we speak about atzmut. What is this atzmut? So we're going to bring out 8 points, which will give us clarification of atzmut. And also, it'll describe the relationship between God and the world. Now, before we go on, I want to pose a few questions, and I want you to keep these questions in your mind, okay? The question is, why was it necessary for God, or why did God desire to create the world in a system of layers? He said that there's this whole chart here. So the first thing is the Orein Sof, the infinite light that comes out of God, right? Which that doesn't allow for the creation of the worlds. It's a very powerful divine energy. It reflects the essence of God. In order for the creation to happen, it has to go through a whole bunch of interactions and changes and devolutions. Number one, there has to be the big tzimtzum. And after there's the big tzimtzum, there's the infinite light and the finite light. The infinite light is concealed. The finite light comes out, but the finite light has many levels in it. And they're so powerful that they clash in the world of Tohu. Then after that, the infinite light emerges with the 3 columns through Keter. And then it continues on until it comes to Atzilut. But Atzilut is still a godly consciousness, right? And it's the 3 columns. Then it has to go through the Parsa, which we talked about last week, the screen, which blocks it out. and then a very filtered new kind of light that comes out, which is its own consciousness, and it creates one world, which is the world of Bria, which is the highest world, the world of angels, the world of souls, myriads of levels until it comes to the bottom level and it comes to the basement, which is where we are. Why did God do that? Couldn't have God just said, poof, let there be world, and the world is there? What do we need this whole thing for? This is question number one. Question number two is, if God goes through all these levels, where is God himself? Is he hiding behind these levels? Is he abstract? He's somewhere else? Or is he here with us? Are these levels just his proxies through which he is interacting with us? Now, I'm going to have to give you the answer to that second question immediately, because otherwise it's bordering on idol worship, right? So the answer is no, they're not proxies of God. It's just the way God is using his tools and instruments through which to create and function in the world. But it still brings us back to the first question. The answer will be given at the very end, and it's actually found in a verse. You won't find it in a text here, but it's a verse that we recite every day in the prayers, 3 times a day. And it's not in the Shema. It's in the Ashrei. So I will give you that secret as we get to that a little later. But it's important. Why is this important? Because everybody, anyone that's religious, anyone that's a theologian, will accept that God is so infinite or so abstract that they cannot explain how God can have a relationship with us. So they have to invent mechanisms through which they think God relates to us. Some created idol worship, some created mediators. The Sfirot are not mediators. The worlds are not mediators, they're just instruments. It's just like if somebody picks up a hammer to bang a nail, the hammer is not an entity to itself. It's not that the hammer decided to bang the nail. The hammer has no ability to do anything without the human that is actually doing it. The hand is not an independent entity. So the fact that he uses instruments doesn't mean that he didn't do it. If somebody kills another person with a gun, he can't use a defense. My gun did it, I didn't do it. Or if you stabbed someone, it was my knife that did it, I didn't do it, because it's all one. So we have to understand that even though there are all these layers, they're not something separate from God. They're part of God and God's consciousness. But we still have to understand how God can have the relationship with us. In order to understand it, we're going to try to now understand what is God to the best of our ability. And the truth of the matter is that whatever we understand is whatever the human mind can comprehend, with the admission and the recognition that it's way off, but at least we have some sort of insight. So one of the things that we talk about Atzmus is that Atzmus is God himself, and we see God as a source for everything. He's the supreme being, or as the Rambam writes, he's the first being, and from him all beings emanated. But there's a problem with that. What's the problem with that? God is undefined. No description can contain God. So let's give a look in text 2. So far, you following me? Good. Because as you see the title of this reading, it's called When Words Fail. And it's not because of a lack of vocabulary or grammar. It's because what we're dealing with is not something that lends itself to description. So let's see what the Rebbe Rashab, 5th Chabad Rebbe, writes in text 2 on page 178. Every title is a description, an attempt to describe something about a particular entity. It follows that the recipient of that title is an entity with a degree of definition or limitation that lends itself to description. Okay, you understand that? Now, none of this is true of God's essence. And we are left without any form or name or title by which to refer to him. In other words, God is not something that we can describe. God is not that God is higher than everything else, because the moment you say God is higher than everything else, then there's some sort of comparison between God to everything else. Even the infinite light that emanates from God, to say that God is the source of that means that you're already putting God in the context that God is a source for light. God is way beyond that. God is not light. God is beyond light. God is beyond description. So the only thing we know about God is that we know God is the creator. So that's why he says, our knowledge of Atzmut is limited to the fact that he creates. Consequently, we have no way to refer to Atzmut except to describe him as the creator. Right? So the first thing that we have to say is that he has no definition. At the same time, we know that if we limit God to the title creator, we're actually defiling God. Because if God's greatness is that God is the creator, of course, it's a great thing to create. And as we're going to learn later, that only God can create. But to say that God's greatness is reduced to the fact that he can create the world, we're missing the point. God is way beyond that. So even though we say he's the creator, but that's only because that's the only way we know him. Yes. About the names that are given. So the names, the question is, what about the names that are given in the Torah? You will actually see in some of the readings that we have scattered around about the names. The names is only, a name is only an expression of one of his faculties. So for instance, when you say the name El, which we say Kale, so Kabbalah says it's referring to the faculty of kindness. So the name is describing a particular faculty that is dominating and expressing itself. If you say Elohim, you're defining God's discipline or God's judgment, or the name of justice, the name of contraction. So each name defines a revelation of God. It's godliness, but it's not God himself. God is beyond name. What about the name that was supposed by? That's the Yud Kei Vav Kei in a special pronunciation. It's called the Shema Etzem. The Shema Etzem means that it's the essential name. It's the name that's closest to express the essence of God, but it's only a name, it's not God. And we will soon see that actually Yud Kei Vav Kei is limiting God. As we will see it from another way. We'll see it when we talk about the Yechida. We're going to get to the Yechida. So then we'll reserve to talk about that it's only a name and the difference between a name and the essence. There is a prayer in the Amidah that says, Ata echad v'shimcha echad. You're one and your name is one. By the fact that we say you're one and your name is one means to say that the name is not you. The name is an expression of you. But the name is not you. God is beyond the name. For that reason, during the time of the giving of the Torah, when God revealed his essence, what did he say? Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So the first word was Anochi, I am, my essence. Only after that did he say the Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the name that the Kohen Gadol would invoke. That's only an expression of the divine infinite essence, but it's still not the essence of Hashem. Anochi is the I am that is beyond description. So for that reason, we use the word Atzmut. So when someone says the creator, of course, it's a great title because only God can create. But to limit God to the power of creation is an injustice. It's limiting God, what God really is. So Atzmut has no definition whatsoever. So I want to take it one step further just to make it easier. You won't find atzmut on this page. The highest you'll find is Ein Sof, divine infinity. You won't find atzmut. That's why you don't find zone 6. Because God is not on top of the heap. God is not on top of the mountain. God is beyond the mountain. God is beyond being counted as part of this. This is only something that derives and extends itself from God. But you can't say that God is on top of it, because that means that God is already part of it, but he's the highest. The moment you say God is the highest, that's already an insult. Right? Why is it an insult? Because you say he's the highest compared. There was one of our teachers that was speaking about humility. And what is humility? So he was speaking. There was one of the students that was a genius, and he thought he was great. He said, what is humility? Humility. Moshe was the highest. And compared to Moshe, I'm humble. But compared to all the others, I'm great. What does that mean? When you say even Moshe was the greatest of all, but Moshe was still in the realm of humanity. He was the greatest of all humanity. You say God is even higher than the Ein Sof. When you say God is higher than Ein Sof, that's already a comparison to the Ein Sof. When it's not even comparable. You can't even say that he's incomparable. And we're soon going to see an expression about that. So therefore, it's beyond description. So the only word we can use is atzmut. This is an important thing to understand. So that's number one. God is beyond description. Yes.
I always read that during the time before the first and second temple were destroyed, the high priest would go behind the curtains and say Hashem's name.
No, you got it mixed up because he mentioned it before. It was before the destruction of the first temple.
That's what I said.
Oh, I thought you said between.
Oh, I thought it was during both.
No. Well, it was even during the second, but during the second, the ark wasn't there, so it wasn't at the same level. We're still going to learn about the ark for a minute, so you'll see what I mean by that. But he said the name of God, but even the name is only a name, and that's what Brad asked before. It still doesn't describe the essence of God.
Infinite number of descriptions.
You can't even say an infinite number of descriptions because that's already okay. So that was the first thing that was said about Atzmut. Atzmut is beyond description. Now we come to another concept about Atzmut. Atzmut, if you give a look at the screen, Atzmut is an existence that must be and has no cause. What we refer to it, the Barbanel writes about it, that it's called Mechuyav HaMetziut. Mechuyav HaMetziut means it's a mandatory existence. It's not an existence that's a choice or contingent upon something else, or someone chooses it. So that's a very important point. Okay, I don't even have to describe that. Now we're going to come to another thing before we come to the Nimna HaNimnoet. And this is the one piece that we mentioned in the early class, and people looked at me, but here is when you're going to get this explanation. I'm going to read it first, and then we'll explain it. Go to page 184, text number 3. This is taken from the Rebbe, our Rebbe, in a Maimer, and he says the following. In truth, even infinity doesn't express Atzmut. Why doesn't infinity express Atzmut? Because infinity itself is a defined character. It's infinite. That's its defined character, that it's infinite. So therefore, you can't define God by anything, right? Rather, God's essence is neither finite nor infinite. Now, the human mind cannot understand it because to us, we work in the realm of existence or non-existence, finite or infinite, limitations or no limitations. So what does it mean that it's not infinite? Because infinite is also a description. Infinite is not finite. That in itself, that infinite is not finite, that defines it and characterizes it as something. In other words, even if you're going to look at the qualitative aspect of infinity, not on the quantitative, because the quantitative is easy to understand. Numbers and beyond numbers. So God is even beyond that. But even on a qualitative level, when you talk about infinity, the concept of infinity is that it doesn't lend itself to finite. And since the concept of infinity doesn't lend itself to finite, that's already a limitation on God, and God has no limitations. And since God has no limitations, for that reason, the infinite doesn't express Atmos, God, more than the finite. The qualities of infinity and finite apply exclusively to divine revelation. It's only about revelation. What does it mean, revelation? So let's talk about this because the term is giluyim, and giluyim is translated as revelation. I will call it as something that extends or manifests itself. We call it manifestations. The difference between an essence and a manifestation. This is a very important point. So let's stop for a second and talk about essence and manifestation. The truth to be known is that when you have a relationship with another person, as close as you may be with them, you may not know their essence. You may know their manifestation. You may not only know their finite manifestation, you might know their infinite manifestation. You might know all of their characters. You might know what makes them tick. But to understand what the essence is, the essence of purity, that's very, very hard. The essence doesn't usually reveal itself. The essence remains hidden. It even remains hidden from ourselves, that we don't even know what our essence is because we operate also on a level that we see ourselves by our manifestations. So you can sometimes have that our manifestation, we extend ourselves through a finite manifestation, which let's say is thinking, intellectual ideas, or having feelings. Those are all finite. Or sometimes we can express our infinite side, which is our inner desire or our inner pleasure, our inner delights, which are not limited to the same level as the faculties. Remember, we talked about it when we were in lesson number 3, when we talked about Keter. So that's an infinite. When you have a desire that is not that is not formulated by any particular reason, but it's an inner desire that comes from your essence. So you have that's also a manifestation of your infinity, but it still doesn't say your essence, because the essence is very hidden. The essence comes out only when you're challenged with life. When someone has to give their life, that's when their essence can come out. Or if something extraordinary happens, their essence comes out. It could be with parents and children. So when we talk about Hashem, all of the divine energies, whether it's finite or infinite, is only about the manifestation of God, but they have nothing to do with the essence of God. So even the infinite light that reveals itself before the Tzimtzum, which is a reflection of the essence of God, still doesn't reveal the essence, because the essence is unknowable. And therefore, for God, there's no distinction between the infinite and finite. It's just different manifestations. But for the essence of God, it's not there. So this is a very important point, because it'll come full circle soon. This is contrary to conventional religious thinking, because religions are usually obsessed with miracles. Why are religions obsessed with miracles? You want to move just a drop so I can see Connie as well. I hope you don't mind. Just a drop. There you go. So I can see everybody. I can see you too. So, but I can't see the people on the screen. So what I'm saying is the following. Religions generally are very much taken by miracles as the power of God. It's a miracle, right? And what this verse is telling you, the manifestation of God can be revealed either in a miracle or in nature. No distinction. The reason that we think we see God more in a miracle is because we associate infinity with God, because only God can break nature. And we forget that only God can make nature, and only God can sustain nature. So what the Rebbe is saying here is that the essence of God is not defined not by finite or infinite, or it could be equally expressed through finite or infinite, because the essence is not limited by that. It's a very, very important point. There was someone that once wrote to the Rebbe, why don't we see miracles today as much as we saw in the past? And the Rebbe quipped back to him in writing, why do you need to come to a situation that you'll need a miracle? When do you need a miracle? When someone has a severe illness, someone has poverty, someone has a problem. Pray to God you shouldn't have a problem, then you don't need a miracle. Because they forget that God is in when everything goes normal is also God. You know, I hate to reduce it to the story that I once told that somebody was late for an appointment and it was a very important meeting and he came and there was no parking spot. So he says, God, if you find me a parking spot, I promise I will go to synagogue every day. And all of a sudden a car pulls out and he says, sorry, I found one of my own. Right? So it's the tendency that people have that they think a miracle is where you see God, but in normal things you don't see God. Okay, now we're going to come to one more term. You're following me so far? I hope this is a very difficult, sensitive, complex class, this last lesson. So I'm trying to myself break it down so that I should understand it, and I'm sharing it with you so that we can both work with it together. So now we're going to come to another description. Once you say that infinite and finite is not necessarily the way God is described, and it's not, God is not limited by that, and he can use either one. So we find a term actually in a book of responsa, which is not even Kabbalah, was written by the Rashba. And he uses the term called Nimna HaNimnoat. If you give a look on the screen, you will see this term. It's also on page 185. Nimna HaNimnoat. The simplest translation is the impossibility of the impossible. But what Nimna means that it's indescribable. And he's using it double to say the indescribable of the indescribable. In other words, you can't even say that it's indescribable. Because the moment you say it's indescribable, you're already differentiating it from something that's describable. So its connection to something that is describable is that it's indescribable. But you can't even say that God is indescribable. So therefore, the only term is Nimna HaNimnoat. So you can't say it's possible or impossible for God. It doesn't even exist in that world. So this is a very important concept of the Nimna HaNimnoat. And the Nimna HaNimnoat was expressed in the Beit HaMikdash. And here's where it was not only about the Kohen, the high priest, but it was actually expressed with the Luchot. So it says in the Medrash, this is the Luchot. You know what the Luchot is? The Luchot is the ark with the cherubs on top of it. It was made of gold plate inside, gold plate outside, and shitha wood. And that's where the tablets that God gave Moses was there. So it says in the Medrash, Makom ha'aron eina min amida, that the space of the ark wasn't measurable. What does it mean it wasn't measurable? So you see the length of the ark was 2.5 cubits. The length of the room that it was in was 20 cubits. And yet, when they measured it, it was 10 cubits on each side, and the room was still 20 cubits. They could never explain it. Because It was ironic. If this ark was off by even a fraction of an inch, it would not be able to trigger that miracle. It had to be built precisely to the measurements that were given in the Torah, which expresses finite. And only through that was there the revelation of the infinity. So it was a combination of finite and infinity because nothing is impossible. So many times when Hasidus wants to give the example of Nimnam Nimnot, that nothing is impossible, that you can't say that space is measurable, they give the example of the Luchot. But the concept of Luchot means that number one, the concept of Nimnam Nimnot is not only that he doesn't have any limitations and he's indescribable, but you can't even say that he's indescribable. So therefore, nothing is impossible for God. Number three, I don't know what the picture means, so don't ask me. I haven't been in kindergarten for a long time, but I do know what the words say. I know, but I will deviate a little bit from the text of the JLI because they give you the freedom to use your own words, and I'm not happy with the examples that they give, and you will soon see why. You'll see why, because they reduce it to a boss that can make his own rules and change the rules anytime he wants. To me, that's a dictator. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about here something else entirely. We're talking here that it's not just that there's no limitations. And I want to put it into the proper perspective. So listen to me for a minute. There are certain rules of life that we learn about through experience, right? So if we want to take a path in life and we failed or we hit some bumps, so we look for another path and then that becomes our rule in life. But then there are some rules in life that nature itself has put into place. 2 plus 2 is 4 is not something that I decided one day. 2 plus 2 is 4, and I reject the notion of 2 plus 2 is 5, unless I'm the media today when it comes to Israel, so they can do that. But generally speaking, everybody knows 2 plus 2 is 5, is 4, except, right? Except if you are part of the BBC or some of the other. Or can a parent be younger than a child? I'm not talking about in looks or in feeling. I'm talking about, is it possible? Those are rules. Those are rules that nature has put into place. Where do these rules come from?
People.
What?
People.
No. Life itself. Even if a person never did math, does it change the fact that 2 plus 2 is 4? No. It's part of life. It has nothing to do with human mind. The same thing that a parent is older than the children is not something that you need a person to suddenly discover it. It's a fact. But the reality is, the reason it's so is because that's the way God decided. Theoretically, even though our mind can't accept it, if God would have created the world in such a way that 2 plus 2 is 5, could he do it or not? Absolutely. Could God make that the children should be older than the parents? Of course he can. He's not bound by any, that's the meaning that he's not bound by rules. And this brings us to another concept. And I think that that's where the JLI missed one point, and I'm not smarter than them, but I'd like to put it into perspective of the way I studied it through my teachers, because I'll tell you an experience that I had with the JLI number of years ago. We were doing biblical reflections, and we were talking about Adam and Eve. And we were talking about Adam and Eve on the spiritual level. They only knew the difference between truth and false. And then when they ate from the forbidden fruit, all of a sudden they were able to tell what's the difference between good and bad. And one of the students, who actually has the title doctor, Jeff, you were there, it's one of your friends, it's not you, said, good and bad is a subjective term. So I asked him, do you think Hitler was good or bad? He said it's subjective. To the Jews, he was bad. To the Germans, he was good. And I realized at that time that that was a diversion and it was going off from the subject matter. But I also realized that there's a misconception of what defines good and what defines bad. If good and bad was defined by humans, it's definitely subjective. But Judaism doesn't see it that way. Judaism sees good and bad as God's will or against God's will. God endorses it or wants it, that's called good. God does not want it, then it's called bad. But that was also God's choice. And that's what the next reading is about. That the rules of good and bad that we live by is not human interpretation of what we decide. That's the difference between God's law and human law. Human law is made up by a group of people. They come to a place, they decide what is the best way to live. And for their society, these are the best rules. So if you came to Sodom, their definition of good was being inhospitable. Bad was being hospitable. So if somebody was accused of hospitality, they were deemed bad and they were put to death because that's human law. In Torah, we don't define good or bad by our own judgment, what we think is good or bad. In Torah, it's what Hashem says. So this is what the next reading is saying, but it has implications to a lot of other things as well. Let's give a look in text 4. It's a very bizarre medrash, but if you understand what I just told you, the medrash actually will make a lot of sense. So page 186, text 4. From the start of the universe's creation, God foresaw the deeds of the righteous and the deeds of the wicked. As it is stated, God knows the ways of the righteous, and the ways of the wicked are doomed. That's taken from Psalms. This was represented at the start of creation as follows. Because it says in the Torah in Genesis, the earth was chaotic and desolate. This refers to the deeds of the wicked. God declared, let there be light. This refers to the deeds of the righteous. However, the narrative has yet to clarify the genre of deeds that God desires. Is it these or those? This is clarified in the following verse. In other words, did God want evil or good? Did he want light or darkness? And therefore, there's a clarification in another verse that says God saw the light was good. Clearly, God desires the deed of the righteous and does not desire the deeds of the wicked. Now, what's the problem with this medrash? Okay, that's a good question. If he didn't like the wicked, why did he create them? Because he wanted to challenge the good. But I have a bigger problem here. What's the bigger problem here?
Doesn't define what good means for us.
You're right. He doesn't define what good means for us. We'll answer that in a minute. But the question, I really already answered the questions. Therefore, it's not a question to you. But the question is asked, why does it need to state in the Torah that God saw the light was good and therefore he chose good? Is it even a question? If you present to God the choice, is a good life mean robbing a bank? Or is good meaning helping the elderly? What do you think God would answer?
But how would we know what he thinks?
That's not the point. Knowing God, what do you think God would answer? I'm not asking what you would answer. What do you think God would answer? Obviously, and this is what the Medrash is trying to say. What the Medrash is trying to say is that the definition of good and bad is not based on what we feel is right or wrong. The definition of good and bad is what God chose. But the reason why helping the elderly is considered good is because that's what God chose. This is a very important concept. I want to see 2 chats. Okay. Let me try to explain it. There's another Gemara that says that if God didn't give us the Torah, we would have learned modesty from a cat. We would have learned kindness from a different animal, whatever, I forget which animal it was. We would have looked at nature and incorporated that to be our life and chosen good deeds. Right? So what is the Gemara trying to say about that? Gemara says that why did God give us these laws? He should have relied on us. We should choose how to be good and how not to be good. How not to be bad, in other words. So the answer is that God wanted that our life should be in sync with God. So therefore, when you are doing an act of kindness, you're not doing the act of kindness because your need is to give kindness, but you're doing it because that's God's will. Or when you're refraining from doing something bad, it's not because my consciousness doesn't allow me to do bad. You're not doing bad because that's God's command, because ultimately the definition of good and bad is God. Understand what I'm saying? There's a Rashi that brings down from a Medrash that a person who never ate non-kosher should say, I might like pork, but what should I do? God commanded me not to eat it, so therefore I'm not eating it. The reason they say someone that never tasted non-kosher is because if someone did eat non-kosher and they say, okay, I like pork, maybe they'll go back to it. What is the meaning of that? The meaning of that is that even instinctual kind of behaviors that you say that you're doing because this is what your gut tells you to do, that also has to be done because it's a command from God. Because ultimately we recognize that even the good that you have within yourself is a creation of God. And the rejection of that is also creation of God. And that is the point that God is beyond rules, that God writes the rules. God gave us this natural instinct that we should want to do good and we should have compassion and that we should reject bad. But we have to recognize that that's a way of worshiping God. That's part of God's command. Because God is beyond rules. Theoretically, God could have written the rules any which way he wanted. Right? And there were societies that did believe it, like Sodom that I mentioned before. So the point of the matter is that God is beyond rules, and God writes the rules. So he defies rules. So therefore, rules don't define God at all. So when it says in the Torah, follow God just as God is kind, therefore you should be kind, it's not because there's a rule that forces God to be kind. It's because God chose that that's the rule that should be, which is kindness. Okay. Now, another point, and that is called Bechira Chavshit. Okay, so far we're okay. We've discussed, if you give a look on page 188, you see figure 4. He has no definition whatsoever. The only entity that necessarily exists, follows rules, no rules whatsoever. He's the source of rules. And the fact that he's the source of rules is very, very important. Because one more point that I wanted to say before I go on is that anything that emanates from light, from God, even light, is not because that's the nature of it, it's because God willed it. Like, for instance, if you look at the sun has no choice. Its purpose in creation was to give off light, to be a luminary. So it's not like the sun has a switch and one day he's in a bad mood and says, I'm going to play hooky, I'm going to be in bed, I'm not going to illuminate. It's not possible. If the sun is there, it illuminates. The only thing that stops the illumination is if there's an outside obstruction. The light that emanates from God is, even though it is on the same level that it's a natural reflection, but it's all by choice because God writes the rules, which this brings us to this point about choice. Free choice. Now, the term free choice is used very loosely by humans. But humans almost never face a situation where they have free choice. Free choice doesn't mean that I'm free to choose whatever I want. Free choice means that you have no compelling reason to choose one over the other. And when you choose it just because you have decided so. Usually when we make a choice, the choice is there because if I choose to give my child food rather than my neighbor's child, that's not a free choice. That's a choice because I have a responsibility to my child. Most 99.9% of choices that we make are not free. There's something underlying. It could be our natural instinct. It could be our essential character that compels us to choose. It could be choosing a color because this color resonates with us. It could be choosing a lifestyle or choosing a job. Whatever it is, it's not true free choice. The only one that has true free choice is God. Why? Because God has no source. God is not compelled to do anything. So if you give a look at the screen, a choice that originates completely from within the chooser and is not compelled even by the slightest by any external consideration.
Rabbi.
Yes. I need to explain this a little bit more because it's really bringing out a very deep concept, which the Rebbe explains brilliantly in a discourse. And it's mind-boggling when you think about it, but I'll explain it to you in a minute. Yes.
Why do we study Atzmut?
Why do we what?
Why do we learn about Atzmut?
Because that's the main thing. Atzmut is God. You don't want to have you don't want to have a relationship with God's revelation. You want to have a connection with God, the essence of God, and the essence of God is Atzmut. Atzmut.
Talk about these veils and
these. So we're going to answer the question. Yeah, we're going to answer that later. Why we need that, but the ultimate is for us to have a connection with the essence of God, not with the revelations of it.
How do we express or how do we experience that?
Okay, we'll get to that answer first. Before we get to the incomprehensible, let's first see what it is that is incomprehensible. We can't even say the word incomprehensible. Okay? So I'm going to throw a question out to you, and that'll give us the understanding of the freedom of choice. When it comes to the Jewish people or the people of Israel, Moses in the book of Deuteronomy says, "Banim atem laHashem Elokechem, you are all children, you're children of God." Right? And he says, "B'cho bahar Hashem," that God chose you. So a lot of times when we talk about the relationship between us and God, we talk about the relationship. God is our Father, we're the children, and therefore there's that unbreakable bond between God and us, just like a parent loves a child, no matter if the child messes up, there is still that relationship and that bond, right? You've heard that many times, right? So I'm not telling you something new. So even if a child messes up, forgiveness comes from the essence of the heart, because what parent doesn't want to have a relationship with their child? Therefore, on Yom Kippur, we come to God and we say to God, we are your children. We repent, please forgive us. But this leads to a question. Question is, if that's the case, why does Moses say, Ki b'cha b'char Hashem? Because God chose you. That's not called choice. You don't choose your children over someone else. You don't choose. Rabbi Manis Friedman once was asked, what does his wife do? And he said she takes care of 10 homeless children. Wow. You open up your house to 10 homeless children? Yeah. Where did you get them? She gave birth to them. Says, why are they home? Why do you call them homeless? Because if she didn't take care of them, they were homeless. Right? What he was trying to bring out, is this point. We naturally take care of our children. So you can choose to pay the tuition of someone else's child to go through college as a gift. But when it comes to your child, it's not a matter of a choice. You have an obligation to educate your child. You can make a choice whether to fulfill your obligation or not. But if you choose them, it's not called a choice. You're doing it because there's a connection. So if it says that God chose the Jewish people from all the nations of the world, and then we say that you are children to God, it doesn't fit, doesn't go hand in hand. There's not a corollary one to the other, because you don't choose your children. So what does it mean? Either the relationship with God and us is because we're his children, or the relationship is that he chose us.
Why is it either or?
What I just said now.
No.
If it can't be both, because then it's not called choice. True choice is free choice. If it's not free choice, it's not called choice. The meaning of choice means that you're choosing something without a compelling reason. If it has a compelling reason, it's not a choice. Then you're mandated to do that. You're compelled to do that. That's not called choice.
Perhaps he chose before.
What?
Sorry. Perhaps he chose before
He chose them and then he made them children. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to put it into the proper words. Yes.
The story that we always hear, where God went around to all the nations, asked them if they would accept certain mitzvahs or whatever. They all sit down and finally get the Jewish people, when this happened, before creation or whatever, and we say yes. So in essence, we chose him.
Yes, but then it does. Then
the contract was made. So,
but then we're not children. Then we're adopted. We're not children.
And he didn't choose us. We chose him.
But then why are we called children?
Yeah.
That's where I'm getting
trying
to.
to muddy the waters.
Okay. So the Rebbe answers something very interesting. And he speaks about the essence of God. And he says the true, pure essence of God is not revealed when God is our Father. Because the very fact that you say a father means that there is something connected to him. So he's not pure. He's not truly independent, because now he's a source to something else. We can't define God as a source. The essence of God is beyond source. So when you say God is a father, that's not the essence of God. That's already a manifestation of God. It's important to mention it because that manifestation is a pretty high manifestation, and we want to connect to God on that level of the manifestation. When the Torah says that God chose you, he's saying that the root of the soul is even higher than the root of a child and a father or in a mother. He's saying that the root is so deep, it's deep in the purity of the essence, which is only where free choice can exist. Huh?
God's free.
That's the only definition of true free choice. So the only true free choice is in God, and that's where the essence is. So there's no compelling reason why God chose us. It's just only because he chose us. And that's called freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is an essence where he is not, even a parent and a child, you feel an obligation to the child. Sometimes you're frustrated, sometimes you're not, but you're bound by that. Free choice means that you're not bound by that because it's beyond that. It's beyond the level of being a parent. It's the essence of God that is so pure that there is no compelling reason. It's the essence of the purest essence of the divine. And that's where he chose. That's why the source of the soul of Israel is so high that it's even higher than a parent, a child and a parent. It goes to the very essence. And the reason why this is important, and that'll answer your question as well, is because of tshuva. What is tshuva? So the Talmud Yerushalmi tells an interesting story. They came to wisdom and they asked wisdom, what happens if someone sins against God? And wisdom said he should be put to death. They came to the Torah and they asked the Torah, what should one do if they sinned? He said they should bring an offering, a sin offering. They came to God and they asked God, what should someone do if they sinned? God said, let him do tshuva and it'll be wiped away. Furthermore, we will see something that Maimonides says in text 5. In text 5, on page 188, the Rambam says, nothing stands in the way of tshuva. Even if one denied God's existence throughout their entire life, and they repented in their final moments, they merit a portion of the world to come. The concept, ein lacha davar ha'omed b'fnei tshuva, there's nothing that stands in the way of tshuva. It's a very troubling concept. How is it that if someone sinned, they could be forgiven? Now, tshuva, we're talking about tshuva to get forgiven is not talking about a plain I'm sorry. It's talking about like a Elazar ben Dordaya. Elazar ben Dordaya was a man that the Talmud describes transgressed every sin imaginable. And then he was sitting in the study hall and he heard this statement, Ein lecha davar she'omed b'fnei tshuva. There's nothing that stands before tshuva. And he realized how far he is from God, and he sat down on the floor, and he put his head on his knees, and he started to cry, begging God for forgiveness, and he cried so much that his soul left his body. He died. And when his soul ascended, it said that he goes straight to Gan Eden, goes straight to the Garden of Eden. So there's a whole debate, how does he have Garden of Eden? It's true that he was forgiven, and his soul is clean, but in order to go to Garden of Eden, he has to have merits. So they have a whole discussion that he adopted the merits from someone else, but that's not the point over here. So how does tshuva happen? And this goes also to the story of Yom Kippur. What happens on Yom Kippur that God forgives? And if you think about forgiveness, we can learn from human forgiveness and apply it to God's forgiveness. When it says, Ein lecha davar ha'omed b'fnei tshuva, there's nothing that stands before tshuva, it doesn't differentiate between what kind of sin. It could be any sin. It could be even the worst sin possible. And he says, even kafar be'ikar. You know what kafar be'ikar means? The most horrible sin to God, denying God's existence. It's called a kafar be'ikar. And even that person can reconnect. So how's that possible? Choice. What's the meaning of choice? It means the following. It's not that God chooses to forgive him. It's because the connection of the soul to God is higher than any manifestation. It's even higher than God's desires, which God's desires are the mitzvahs, or God's desires are not to do the averet, not to do the transgressions. But the source of the soul is in the essence of God. When a person reaches that essence that is higher than even the desires of God, and they connect at that level, everything is washed away. But it requires a tremendous amount of effort on their part that they should be able to get it. As it says, Karav Hashem l'chol asher yikru'u be'emes. God is close to those that call him honestly, with integrity, truthfully, not someone that's just playing the game. Give a look at the way the Rebbe explains it. The Rebbe explains it in his private notes in text 6. Violations of the divine will, that's the divine desire, are felt most keenly by the divine author who scripted the will, which means God should be the most sensitive that you violated his desire. On the other hand, God transcends his own will, because we're talking about the essence, which is where the area of the free choice, and is not compelled to react to violations in a particular way. For who can tell him what you're doing? In other words, this is the level that's beyond all the rules. It's the inner essence of God. Consequently, through tshuva, which is loftier than all the mitzvahs, and which touches the innermost depth of God's desire, one can attain atonement. So this is why it's important to understand this, that the Atzmut is not bound by any rules. The Atzmut is not bound even by his own desires, but he chose to bind himself to the soul of the person. And therefore, if the person reaches that innermost level through reaching the depth of their soul, which is the Yechidah, as we're soon going to see, which happens on Yom Kippur, so then they can get forgiveness. They can get forgiveness. So that is the power of Atzmus, which brings us to the next state. That's what it means, a clean state. Why? Generally, when we act with each other, we act through manifestations. All of the revelations from God was through the Seder Ishtalshalus, the order of development, right? We went through all the 5 zones. So we went lesson 1 and lesson 2 and lesson 3, which we talked about it. I don't need these apps, sorry. Right? Now we come to something which is deeper. The Yechidah, the essence of the soul. What is the essence of the soul? The essence of the soul. So let's see what it says here. There are 5 levels to the soul. The highest level, which is blocked out by the top of the screen, is Nefesh. The lowest level is Nefesh, which that corresponds to the world of Asiya, which is the lowest world. Above that is Ruach, which is the spirit, which we talked about many times. That's why I'm not describing it. Ruach is the spirit, which is higher than Nefesh. Nefesh is just the desire to survive and live. That's where a Nefesh of a person could be just as an animal. They eat, drink, sleep, work just to survive. Ruach is the spirit. The spirit ascends higher. Neshama is the divine. It's even higher than the spiritual. It's the godly. And then there's the Chaya. The Chaya is like the infinite part, the desire that's within the person. But then there's the quintessential, which is called the Yechidah. And that's the Atzmus of the person, the Atzmus of the Nefesh. On Yom Kippur, we have 5 prayers. Because on Yom Kippur, we're able to transcend all the levels and enter into the Yechidah, our own Yechidah. And that Yechidah connects with the Etzem of God. And for that reason, we can attain that forgiveness of God because the Etzem of God is revealed. So this is why it's necessary to understand, and that answers your question, the Atzmi. Nefesh. Nefesh. Atzmut and Yechidah are parallel to each other. Not to say that our Yechidah is at the same level as Atzmut, God forbid. But relatively speaking to the human being, we have the ability, if we have the ability to reach to the Yechidah. Yechidah can be done like that Rebbe Elazar ben Dordaya that I mentioned, that he gave his life for God when he was doing tshuva. It could also be at the time of Mesirat Nefesh when someone gives their life away for God, or it could be when someone gives all their desires away for God. That's where they reach the Yechidah. So therefore, it's that concept of Atzmos. Now, I'm looking at the clock and we're running out of time. Here is the way that Rebbe explains it, text number 7, and I think it'll bring a complete picture. Yechidah means that it's the essence of the soul that binds itself with the essence of God. That is the part of God that is not the Father, that God is our source, but it's where the free choice was, which is the essence. And I hope you understood what I meant by the free choice. He's not compelled by anything. It's the true essence of Hashem, and he chose to have the connection with the soul and to create the soul. So he says, together the Jewish people and God form one complete entity, so to speak. This is due to the bond between the very essence of the soul and God's essence. The God essence is Atzmos. By contrast, while the soul's various expressions and powers also enjoy a relationship with God, the levels that we mentioned before, the relationship is susceptible to damage as a consequence of a person's choices. The soul's essence is always intimately bound and united with God in a unity that our sages depict as merged and bonded with you in oneness to be one with you. It's from the liturgy of Sukkot. What does this mean? it can never be defiled, even if a person sinned. That Nukudat Hayada, the Pinta Layid, that quintessential part of the soul, the Yechida, remains one with the Atzmus. So this is all why Atzmus is important. Now, I want to go one more step, and then we're going to play the video, and then we're going to wrap it up, because what we want to get to, and this is also very important, is there is a parallel path that we have in our relationship to God. The parallel path is we don't experience Yom Kippur every day, only once a year. We don't have 5 prayers every day. Those that took the 5 prayers every day desecrate Judaism, because the 5 prayers are unique for Yom Kippur. So what we have is the 3 prayers every day, which deal with the tangible, which is the nefesh, ruach, and neshama. That's what the 3 prayers are made for. So ordinarily, on an everyday life, which is in a finite world, we are not meant to reach atzmut in a conscientious way. We're meant to develop a relationship with God in a human, natural way. And the human, natural way is which way? By understanding God, developing a relationship, and doing what God wants. And how can we do that, that our minds and our hearts should be able to resonate with God when God is so far away from us that he's even indescribable? So for whatever reason, God chose that the relationship should be not an abstract relationship, but a tangible relationship. And the way God chose that there should be a tangible relationship is by creating all these layers. And all these layers are actually a ladder. It's a two-way ladder. It's a ladder the way the divine descended down, and it's also a ladder the way we climb up. And that's what we say 3 times a day, and I mentioned that earlier, in Ashrei. You know, the Ashrei is made up of the alphabet, Aromimcha, B'chol Yom. Every verse starts with an alphabet. When it comes to Lamed, the L word, it says, Lahodia livnei Adam Gvurotov. What is the meaning of that? To make known to the humans the strengths. What does that mean? God doesn't have to show his power. He has to go every day and say, I have bigger muscles than you. No. Gvurotov is the strength and the tzimtzum through which he revealed himself to us. He wanted to have a relationship with us. So he could have created the world, poof, without all these layers, but then there wouldn't have been a rational relationship between us and God. There would have been an atzmos relationship, but it wouldn't have been a rational relationship. God created us with a mind and a heart so that we should take the steps that in the human experience, in the natural experience, we should be able to experience God. So therefore, he made all these layers. But we have to remember that they're only layers, because beyond these layers, there's something which is not just deeper, it's the essence of Hashem that's there. And that essence is the Atzmus. Furthermore, the Atzmus decided that where he wants to live is not in the infinite, but in the finite. And that we're going to see in a moment. But first, before we get there, we're going to play the video.
Welcome to our final episode on the world of Kabbalah. The mystical system stretches like a ladder. In our first episode, we began at its lowest rung and we climbed upward from there. So, before we hit the climax, let's recap our previous steps. Lesson 1. We met the 3 basic layers of God's creation that range from terra firma to the spiritual extreme. Kabbalists call them 3 worlds of created entities: Asiya, Yetzira, and Beriah. What do they have in common? They sense their own identity, and they feel independent from God. We can relate to that all too well. Lesson 2. We rose beyond creation to meet the divine world of Atzilut, home to the Sefirot. The divinity of Atzilut is stamped with the limitations of defined characteristics. We cannot relate to such powerful divinity, but we can connect with its variety of characteristics. Lesson 3. We soared beyond Atzilut to meet Keter. That's a leap from divinity with limitations to God's infinite light. It's difficult for us to relate to God's infinity, but we learned why the infinite light is indispensable for our limited world. Lesson 4. We hit the peak of our ladder and discovered a debris field of a cosmic mystical explosion. During the pre-birth of creation, the intense but chaotic spiritual layer known as Tohu imploded, the effects of which still impact our reality today. Lesson 5. We met the ultimate mystery of creation. How does anything but infinity emerge from God's infinite light? That's where we discovered Tzimtzum, the cosmic process of contracting and concealing divine light to facilitate the emergence of all layers of existence. That was some ride. So what's missing? Well, we've discussed God's creation, its system, purpose, and relevance. We've also discussed God's transcendent divinity. But we haven't discussed God himself. There's a reason for that. God is off the charts. We plotted a path from the foot of the mystical system, that's us, all the way to the greatest divine revelation. But God's self, or Atzmut, the essence, that's beyond any revelation, description, or definition. God transcends all logic and rules, which are merely his own creations. So here's today's surprise. That's exactly what makes God himself most relevant. Why is that? Here's one reason. God designed us in his own image, which means that he gave us the ability, not provided to the rest of the rule-abiding system, to break the divine rules. And we do. We mess up. But where do we go from there? The system works by the book. We threw out the book, so the system won't let us back in. Thankfully, God himself, at his essence, is not bound by the rules he authored. He is free to revise or override at will. And God chose to connect our deepest core, the very essence of our soul, to his own essence. How does that help us? Because our desire to repair our relationship with God after messing up springs from our deepest self. It's the voice of our innermost soul. So when we reach into our deepest self to return to God's embrace, God does the same. He overrides his own system to provide us clemency and atonement. Our sincerity cuts through the cosmos, and God's reciprocating love cuts through his infinite light, the Tzimtzum, Tohu, Keter, Atzilut, Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya, to us. Now, if that's not absolutely relevant, nothing is.
Okay, we're going to sort of bring it to a close because we're late. Now, here is the surprise that he was speaking about in the video. After everything that we have learned now, so until today's class, you would say whatever is closer to God is holier because it's more infinite and more spiritual. So spiritual worlds are greater. Our world we call the cellar, the basement, because it's physical. But actually, the story is that it's a bit different. And that is because the desire of God was our world more than any other world. And in order to explain that, I'm going to detain you for just a few more minutes because it's very important. So you see, the creation of our world wasn't just that God reduced the light until it hid. Because at the end of the day, if it is divine light, it can't be hidden. You know, they have that Hanukkah movie that they made in Israel years ago of we're coming close to Hanukkah, of the battle between the Greeks and the Jews. So the coins that the Jews had were fiery lights, and the coins that the Greeks had were shiny gold. And the Greeks tried to change the lights of the menorah from the fiery to the gold. And they were trying to extinguish the lights. The problem was wherever they tried to hide the light was shining, because that's the nature of light. The light cannot be blocked. So how is it that God creates the world in such a way that we don't even recognize the existence of God? And where is it noticeable? Not in the world of Bria or Yitzir, because over there they have, even though they have their own consciousness, but they are subservient to God because they feel God's power. It's only in the cellar by us that it's blocked off. How is that? Because our creation is called Yesh Me'ayin, something out of nothing. So what does it mean, something out of nothing? God is not a nothing. But God creates this chasm, this distance, where he's so far from us that we can't know him. So when we call ayin, ayin doesn't mean that doesn't exist. Ayin means we don't know what it is. It's beyond our comprehension. And we are the yesh from ayin. So there's that distinction. What is the result of that? The result of that is that it creates independence. We feel as if we are self-made. We feel Mother Nature came into being by itself. We feel as if we made ourselves. That's why you even have people that question if there is a God. There are people that question whether God created the world. Why is that? So Hasidus reveals something unbelievable. Because the only one that can create an entity outside of God's consciousness is Atzmut himself. Since Atzmut is not defined by light or darkness or by limitation or infinity, only God can create, only the Atzmut can create the physical. The spiritual cannot create the physical. Mamala Kalamim, Sovov Kalamim, all the lights can't do that. See how the Rebbe writes it in text dates. This is from a discourse from the Rebbe. The Rebbe says on page 193 in text 8, the difference between the upper spiritual worlds and this material world is that only the inhabitants of our material world experience an existence as entirely independent of any source. The difference between light and a created being, light points to a source. When we see light by its existence, it informs us that there must be a source of light. So there's light in the higher world. So they recognize that the source is God. By contrast, the material creature does not indicate the existence of the creator. In fact, it actively conceals God's existence by projecting itself as an utterly independent existence. Only logic demonstrates the incorrectness of this natural perception, but the natural perception is aniva afsio, that I'm made myself. So conventional religion says that because God's light is so hidden, therefore it creates such a dark world as ours. Comes along the Rebbe and says, absolutely not. It's the opposite. In truth, our existence is entirely dependent on God, and it is only our perception that generates a sense of independence. Nevertheless, the very fact that we imagine ourselves to be self-generated is because our source is Atzmut, the absolutely independent existence. So, in a sense, what the Rebbe is saying here, that who is closer to Atzmut? Is it infinite light or us simple mortal beings? We're closer to Atzmut because we feel Atzmut. We feel independent. So our default setting and our dysfunction of thinking that we're our own actually comes because we were created by Atzmut itself. Now, the Alter Rebbe, I'm going to skip, I don't want to skip anything, but it's important. The upper worlds, just to give you over, the upper worlds feel the presence of God. The lower worlds, our world doesn't. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe writes it in Tanya. Page 196, text 10. The very essence of the Creator, the ultimate independence, existence that has no antecedent or cause it all. He alone has the exclusive power and ability to create an entity from absolute total nothingness, to the extent that all created entities sense that he has no cause or antecedent at all. In other words, that he doesn't have a source and we feel it. Okay? Now, this explains another thing, and I'm sorry to keep you, but this is very important. So it means to say that we have a virtue that nobody else has. Our chisaron, our deficiency, is actually because of the greatness that God himself created it. This explains another thing. It explains two more things. Number one, it explains that the ultimate purpose of God's desire in creation was to create something that is so distant, and that too should be made a dwelling place for God. But it also explains another thing. The neshama, as we said many times, doesn't want to descend into the body. But once it descends into the body, it doesn't want to leave the body. And it realizes the virtue of the body. Why? Because it suddenly assumed a taste for steak or ice cream, or it suddenly realizes that a good mattress and a good night's sleep is really good for it. So it has no connection to that. So why is that? So again, we look at what the Rebbe writes. The Rebbe writes on page 198 in text 11, the soul is a product of divine light, which in it is itself merely an expression of divinity. Conversely, the body is created directly by God's essence, whose existence is absolutely independent and has no preceding cause or antecedent at all. The soul recognizes that the body contains the above superiority because it longs to gain a similar advantage. It desires to bond with the body and its animalistic soul as to guide them through the positive spiritual transformation. Which means to say that the soul all of a sudden recognizes that the body has a superior source to it. Because even though the soul is rooted in the essence of God, but the soul is still a replica in a sense that it is recognizing that it's dependent on God. It's still not at the highest source where it has that level of God's independence. The only one that has it is the body. So when the soul reveals the spirituality in the body, it actually sees that the body is at a higher source than it. And I know this is a very difficult concept, but I want to put it into context. The Ramban, my Nachmanides, argues with Ramban. They have a dispute. Where is the ultimate reward? In the souls without bodies or the souls with bodies? The Rambam goes with conventional wisdom and says it's ludicrous to say that the highest level of the soul's reward is in a body when a body is physical. So therefore, the highest level is when it's in the Garden of Eden, and the true Olam Haba, the world to come, is when the soul is stripped from the body and it's one with God. Comes along with Nachmanides and says, no, the highest level is the resurrection of the dead, Tchiyat HaMetim, because that's where the ultimate is. Comes along the Rebbe and asks a question in a very famous discourse, which that's where this is taken from. And he asked the question, the Rambam is right, not the Ramban, because the body is restrictive, the body is coarse, and it's physical. So he says that the truth of the matter is that the body, the way it appears to us in this world, is detached from God. But in its essence, it comes from an even higher level than the soul. And that's why only the body can display that level of independence. And the soul can never gain it on its own. It can only gain it through the body. Now, I'm not giving you the explanation for it. It's a very difficult concept. I'm just giving you the facts to understand it. What is this leading to? What this is leading to is another fascinating statement, and this will be our last reading of the course. Page 200, text 13. This chapter of Tanya, chapter 36, is one of the most famous chapters, and it's mind-boggling. This could have a JLI course of 6 lessons just on this chapter of Tanya. So he says the following: there's a known statement from our sages that God created this world to enable the fulfillment of his desire for an abode in the lowest realm. The Medrash says that why did God create our world? Because God wanted to have an abode. He wanted to have a house. But he didn't want to have a house in the spiritual world. He wanted the house in the physical world. It's called dira. Dira means a dwelling place, betachtonim, in the lowest levels. That's where it has to be fulfilled. Now, there's no higher and lower in God's presence. Remember, atzmut, there's no such thing as higher and lower. Infinite and finite are all the same, yeah? Because he fills every realm of existence equally. Rather, the description of our world as the lowest realm can be understood by first appreciating that before the creation of the universe, all that existed was God himself. The very space that the universe now occupies was entirely filled with God's presence, right? We learned that in the last lesson. Before the Tzimtzum, it was the infinite light. In fact, that remains the reality even now from the truth of God's perspective. The change caused by creation is only in the perspective of the recipients of God's vivifying energy, because they receive this by way of multiple screens that dim and conceal God's light from their perspective. That's what we discussed last week in the Tzimtzum and the Kav, that it goes from one level over to another level, right? That's all what he's saying here. So I don't have to repeat it. This was already explained in lesson number 5. This concealing process is referred to as the hishtalshalut, what we call the seisha hishtalshalut, the order of development of the worlds, meaning their devolution from each other via interlinked, progressively dimmer realities by way of countless steps of concealment of the divine light and energy. This continues all the way until the creation of this physical, corporal, tangible world of ours, the bottom of the entire chain, right? We're at not the basement, we're at the cellar. There's no lower realm in terms of the concealment of God's light than our world. It is a world of incredible darkness to the extent that it is filled with klipot. Klipot is negative energy that oppose God in actuality and claim that nothing exists beyond their immediate reality. Okay? That no one argues with. The goal, now he's saying, what was the goal of this entire creation, with all the creation of the higher worlds and the angels and all that we learned until now? The goal of the entire chain of interlinked realms of spiritual existence and the purpose of their progressively steeper descent in the term of the divine concealment is not for any of those spiritual worlds. God didn't create the world so the angels should be able to understand him. Rather, the purpose is to arrive at this lowly, tangible world. For it was God's original desire to derive pleasure from mortal efforts to suppress the forces of evil and to transform the darkness into light until God's infinite light shines openly through the entirety of this world, the very habitat of ultimate darkness and the forces that oppose sanctity. So this is the concept. Where is Atzmus revealed? Where is the essence of God revealed? Not in the higher worlds, in the infinite worlds, not even in the world of Bria or Yetzira, not even in Asiya, but here in our lowest level. This is where his desire is. And what was his desire? His desire was that we should refrain from doing evil, not give in to our temptations, and do good by the definition of God, good, the Torah mitzvahs, the physical act that we do of the mitzvah, the giving the tzedakah in a tzedakah pushka, or lighting the Shabbat candle, or putting up a mezuzah, or putting up tefillin, or whatever the physical mitzvah is. That is what he wanted, and that's how he dwells here. But there's a very important statement at the very end, and I started the class by saying that we're living in crazy times when the world is filled with fraud and falsehoods and evil, and people accept it as the truth. That is the darkness of our world. And what is our purpose? Not to be dismayed by it or dissuaded, but rather our purpose is to make this a place of light. And by kindling the light and being proud of it, it will dispel the darkness. This is where it's all about. So we've learned a whole system of Kabbalah, starting from the lowest to the highest and thinking about all the great things. So at the end of the day, I'll ask you a question. And with that, I'll finish. There's a question that I heard from one of the Hasidic teachers who was teaching in Jerusalem. And he said, If you were given an opportunity to go to the city of Meron, the city of Meron is near Tzfat, and that is the resting place of the very famous author of Kabbalah, who was also one of the greatest Tanoim, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And it is Friday afternoon, and you left before sunrise, so you couldn't daven yet. You couldn't put on tefillin. You didn't want to daven on the bus because you wanted to daven in a place where it's calm. And now you have a half hour left until sunset. So you can only put on tefillin in that 30 minutes and daven. And all of a sudden there is noise. The tombstone over Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is moved away. And there Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai emerges in his full glory. And he says, all of you lucky people that are here in Meron, I'm going to reveal the secrets of God and the universe to you. Assemble close to me, and you will get a rise like you never had in your life. And now you have a choice to make. Do I spend the next 30 minutes listening to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and having the rise, or do I put on the tefillin? What is the right answer? You do what God wants. It's not about your rise. It's about what God's desire is. God's desire is to make this into a dwelling place. True, listening to Rabbi Shimon, it'll help you do it. But if you have no choice and it's a question of either you're going to do it or listen to him, that putting on tefillin or that mitzvah that you do is why the world was created. And you're fulfilling that mission at that moment. And that is why the angels from heaven who know Torah better than all of us, it says in the Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs, and the Medrash explains it, they come to hear us study Torah because they realize the Torah that we are learning in the physical body is what God desires, and it gives them their lift, it gives them their elevation. So they are dependent on us. They are waiting for us every day. They're watching us. I gave you this example of imagine of being in a football game at the Super Bowl and it's the last few seconds and you're the quarterback and you're losing, but just by a few points. And one touchdown will change it. And there are 70,000 screaming fans and you're in the home stadium. And there's 70,000 fans screaming. Could you imagine the tension that the quarterback feels at that time when he rises with that football and he thinks, how am I going to get the pass going that I can do the touchdown in the next 6 seconds? And then we win. Imagine that every day you are in a stadium, not with 70,000 screaming fans, but with millions and millions of angels and extra celestial beings in the highest worlds, that they realize that the only reason they were created is because of us. They were created for us, not for themselves. And their whole existence is dependent on us. And their ability to be able to perceive a higher level of godliness is dependent on our action. And they're looking at us. And we walk into a store and we're hungry. And we're looking for something kosher and nothing kosher there. And we say, you know what, God doesn't see. What does he care? I'll buy something that's not kosher. When we do that, they all fall. A collapse, it's an earthquake. But if we make the decision and we say, no, we're going to do kosher and we'll go to another store, even if it's another 10 minutes, they have their high. It's like the scoring of the football. We don't understand, and the Alter Rebbe actually says it in Tanya. It's not to make us feel bad, but to understand that the world is in our hands, not our world, the entire universe. And that's why every little detail that we make is not does God care or God not care. God created the world in such a system that this is where his desire is. And people have it all wrong. It's not that God needs us. God doesn't need anything. God is truly independent. He chose this. Because he chose it, it becomes a reality. So when you do one little mitzvah, that's why the Rambam writes, and with this I'll finish, that you should always see that the world is balanced, and you might be the one that can tip the world in the righteous way. And that one good deed that you do, and the good is defined by God's desire, will tip the scale when Mashiach comes. And that was what the ultimate reason of this whole course is. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the people that joined. We're going to have a fantastic class coming in the next JLI, and it's called The Advice for Life.
Lesson 6. The essence of...
We can hear the music. Thank you all.